So there was an interesting thing that happened after the civil rights movement in the late 60s, early 70s, which is that it no longer became acceptable to say that you are a white supremacist or that you are a racist or to explicitly argue for racist ideas, which I think is great. I think that means that society has progressed and that it's certain ideas are so reprehensible that they're no longer tolerated in the public square. Now, I think that in some ways it's gone a little bit too far with things like cancel culture, and it can be counterproductive to have a conversation with someone who has racist ideas and then just say, "You are a racist," because that's just going to get them to dig their heels in further and dismiss anything that you might have to say, to dismiss the ideas, which is, of course, the problem, not the person, because they could be molded, and they are molded by the things that they're exposed to. And so if all you can expose to them is hostility, that's going to reinvigorate their racist ideas which they were exposed to previously. But that's kind of a separate issue. In general, it's good that racism is no longer accepted. Um, but that didn't mean that all the racists went away in the late 60s, early 70s. They actually stayed more or less where they were, but it just meant that politicians who tried to appeal to the broadest swath of people in order to go to power, and therefore have to kind of walk on eggshells a lot of times with the way that they speak, which is why that politicians are constantly BSing you, and you don't know what they said after they did this big long speech, because it was a bunch of vague, statements about morality and values, and very little policy and very little actionable things. Because that's political speak, because they're trying to appeal to as many people as possible. And so one thing that happened after the civil rights movement was what was called the Southern Strategy, which was a type of right-wing dog whistling by the Republicans, who realized that if they started adopting the language of states' rights, um, if they started talking about states' rights, then they could win over the former slave states, the Confederacy, the segregation states that just had all their, the Voting Rights Act passed and the Civil Rights Act, and they weren't very happy about it. That's a lot of states. They could win all of those votes over from the Democrats, who, to be honest, were appealing to racists for a lot of the 19th century, or at least turning a blind eye to it so that they could continue to work with those segregationists in the South. The Republicans realized they could win those over because LBJ just passed the Civil Rights Act and they didn't like it. And so if the Republicans could start talking about, bringing, rights back to the states, and how the federal government was, impinging on people's rights, that would appeal to a lot of those people, because a lot of them still don't like the Union for, stopping the Confederacy and the states from, going forward with their right to leave the Union so they could continue with slavery, and then their subsequent decision for the states to oppress black people further through the Jim Crow laws. And so that kind of started with the Goldwater campaign. So he was not necessarily a segregationist, but he didn't support the Civil Rights Act, and so that won him a lot of favor in the South. And then Reagan took it to the next level with the explicit Southern strategy, and ever since then, the South has gone to the Republicans. And to me, that's a type of dog whistling which is no longer, which is not the same thing as what was going on before, and I guess that's a type of progress. But let's acknowledge what it is. It's political doublespeak, and it's an appeal to racism. And there frankly have been a lot of other dog whistles over the past 40 years, mostly by the Republicans in this way. And so Ronald Reagan in 1980 decided he was going to run for president. And where does he hold his first rally that he's announcing his run? It's in Philadelphia, Mississippi. And if you're a student of history, you can name one event that's ever happened in Philadelphia, Mississippi, which was the murder of 3 civil rights workers during the 60s there. And so he goes there, he's talking about states' rights, and he's winning over the support of all of the former segregationists that only like 15 or 20 years ago were still discriminating against black people legally at the federal level. And so he goes back there talking about states' rights, gets all of their support. And then we can get to President Trump, who made his political career more or less, arguing that the previous president was actually not the legitimate president because he was from Kenya. He had a Kenyan conspiracy in order to trick the American people into hiring a foreign national whose allegiance just wasn't quite in the right spot. And his evidence for this was actually no evidence at all, because in fact he was not from Kenya, as his birth certificate showed. And it makes you wonder, is there anything in particular about that last president that was different than the other presidents that might make him more suspicious of his loyalty or being a true American? I could think of one reason. It might be this reason. Might be his hair being a little bit different. His last name sounds a little bit not American-y. Just something's not right about it. And then when Ted Cruz runs for president 4 years later, who actually was born in Canada, and everybody knew it, it really was not an issue, because the dog whistlers know that Canada is more American than those other places, and so it's not really, Canada's not the problem, if you know what I mean. And then when there's shithole countries, the countries that are shitholes are not Eastern European countries, they're not Russia, places with people that look like that. The shithole countries are places like Haiti and Liberia, where they just happen to all be of darker persuasion. These are whistles that, these are the type of things that racists would agree with, because racists don't think that they're racist. They just think that other cultures and people have it all wrong because they're just not as advanced. And so this is a good dog whistle. When the monuments are taken down throughout the South, an appeal to heritage and culture is made in order to get those people up in arms about protecting our history and our heritage, as if the contents of that history and heritage don't need to be examined, or the fact that most of the Confederate monuments were put up in the 1920s in order to lock in Jim Crow segregation laws and make black people know where their place was, not right after the Civil War. They were put in decades later, or other ones were put in very hastily and cheaply during the 1960s, during the Civil Rights era, for the same reason, in order to counteract Martin Luther King's movement. These are all dog whistles, and it's not, you can't quite go the David Duke route, even though David Duke is a big fan of the president and of a lot of the Republicans. You have to be a little bit more sneaky. You got to be a little bit more covert. You got to be a little bit more political. But the ends are the same. The ends being the people who were racist in the past and have the most racist views now all go to your side. You win those states, and then you can focus on building a broader coalition with your vague words, which aren't quite as aren't viewed as quite as reprehensible as the explicit statements of the racists of the past. So.